Aha! So, episode 12. And yep, we're back on the eLiquid database and we're back with mix management. So, the last thing that we did was we created two tables with the relevant fields in that will store all of our information for each mix of a recipe that we create, and we'll also manage stock levels, which is the whole purpose of the thing. So yeah, we created those two tables, and now we need to look at some forms. And yeah, there's going to be two forms for the mixing part of the database, much like the recipes, where we have one main form with another form with multiple fields embedded in it, and it will be the ingredients again, but this time for the mix, not the recipe. So let's start off and let's create the main mix form, which is basically going to have the fields from the mix table we created last time. So we're just going to create a basic form. We'll select the mix table, we'll select create, and we'll select form. And there it is. If we go into design view, we have our mix form. Now I'm just going to quickly rearrange things here a bit because I don't really like this default layout. It won't even be the eventual layout that I'm about to do, but yeah, just for getting the whole thing running, I'm going to rejig it a bit. Okay, so that's rejigged a little bit. That's going to suit what we're doing slightly better. We can now close and save the form. Yep, and we'll call it the mix form. Ooh, let's not do it in caps, shall we? Mix form. And now let's create a form for the mix ingredients. Select that, create, and this time we will want a multiple items form. And let's go into the design of that, and once again I'm going to rejig this around to suit what we want a bit better. Right, yep, so that layout's probably going to work for us a little bit better, as you'll see shortly. We'll close that and we'll save it, and we'll call it the mix ing form. We'll do. Done. Now we'll open up our mix form in design view and go to the bottom. We've got a whole load of space here already. And as before, we will drag in and embed as a subform the mix ingredient form, and we'll just pop it there. Let's move it over a little bit, and to tie the two together as we did before, we need to select the master and child fields. So let's do that, and we know that the master field from the main form will be the mix ID, and the child field will be the mix ingredient mix ID. So that ties the two together. This down here is always going to show the ingredients with the same mix ID as we happen to be looking at here. So referring back to our notes, and we have created a basic form for the mix table. We have also created a basic multi-item form for the mix ingredients table, and we have embedded as a child subform into the mix form the mix ingredients form, and tied the two together with a mix ID. Now basically when we open this form, there's going to be two kind of modes. The first one is maybe we want to see all the mixes that we've done. Probably not really likely. More likely we're going to want to see either all the mixes for a specific recipe we've done, or we're going to want to create a new mix from a recipe. Now, as we don't actually have any recipes yet, we're going to ignore the fact that we might be opening it to view mixes already made of a recipe, because there's nothing to see there. So we'll skip over that for a while, and we'll move on to the second part there, which is opening to create a new mix of a recipe. So logically what would happen is you look up a recipe in the database and go, yep, click on a button to make a new mix of that. The mix form opens up, and we start doing our work in there. So the first thing we need to do is to set up some kind of button on the recipe form that we can click to say, yep, make a new mix, and have it pass across some data to the mix form so that it knows which recipe we're opening, so it can go and grab all of that data. It will also need to know whether we are opening it to create a new mix of that recipe or whether we just want to view all of the mixes of that recipe. So we'll kind of put that in, even though we're not going to deal with viewing the mixes already made. So let's pop back over to the old database. And the first thing I want to do is I want to add a few fields to this form so that, because the data being passed is essentially normally invisible to us, whilst we're testing, I'd like to have somewhere where I can actually see that it's passed the right recipe ID over, and yeah, a bit of information to tell us what we're doing. So I'm going to add those fields now. Right, so here we are. Basically, I've created an unbound text field up here, which is just going to display the actual recipe ID requested, as the label next to it would suggest. So in this field, it's just going to fill in what actual recipe ID was passed over to this form when it was opened. We're not going to be editing that, so I'm just going to make it disabled because we don't want to really change it. And we also have a label down here that's going to signify whether we're entering a new mix or viewing existing mixes. Now that obviously needs to change status, so what we'll do is we'll select that and we'll make it invisible by default, like so, and then when we know we're creating a new mix, we'll have the code make it visible again. Now what we need to do is to add the intelligence to this form to receive some data when it's opened and decide if it's a new mix that needs to be created and what recipe it is creating it for. So let's select the form and have a look at the events, and the first thing we're going to have a look at is the onOpen event, and we'll make a code builder, and I'm just going to create a bit of code here which we shall discuss in a second. So here is our code. Now what I've done is I've created some global variables which are going to be available to all of the subroutines and functions, if any, that we have whilst this form is open. It just saves us having to pass from a function or subroutine to another one, and just saves a lot of grief if we have a couple of global variables where we can store, first of all, the recipe ID that we want to work with, and this second global variable, which I've called force new, which basically is saying, yeah, this is, you need to create a new mix for this recipe. I think it'll become more apparent as we move along what they actually do. So then we've, as we did just a second ago, we've created a subroutine that happens on the open form handler. So this is the first thing that happens when the form opens. And the first thing that we're going to do here is set those two global variables to blanks, just so that they're a known state. They're probably null anyway, but we'll just set them to blank text fields. So yeah, they're basically a known state. Then what we'll do is, as we did before, we'll check to see if there are any open arguments passed when the form opened. So if there were some, then basically we're creating a little array. And the array is coming from the open arguments, because we can only send one piece of text, I believe, as an argument when opening it. So what we're going to do is we need to pass two bits of data. We need to pass both the recipe ID and whether we want to create a new mix from that recipe or just view all of the mixes already existing for that recipe. Two bits of data, one bit of text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate those two bits of data with a double star, double asterisk, or whatever you want to call it, and that way we can then go, well, anything before the double asterisk will be the ID, and anything after it will be to say whether it's a new mix or look at the existing mixes. So basically we'll take that bit of text, we'll split it at the stars, and then the bit before the stars we'll say is the RID, the recipe ID, and we'll set that to this global variable so it's available everywhere. So now globally we have global RID is going to equal the recipe ID we're dealing with in this mix, and the second part of that array, i.e. anything after the double asterisk, is going to be whether we want it to be a new mix or view existing mixes. So that's what we've done here, but we haven't actually passed any variables opening arguments to this form. So we need to go back to where we would open this form from and add that bit of logic in. So let's do that now. We'll close down the VBA window. We'll close this form. Yeah, we do want to save it. We'll open up the recipe form in design view. We'll make a bit of space at the top. We will create a button and we'll cancel out of that. We'll give it a caption of make mix. Will do. And make it a little bit, put it up there a little bit, make it a tiny little bit smaller. That'll do. We'll close up that gap. And let's put an on-click handler in for it. Actually, no, let's not do that. Let's give it a reasonable name first. Where are we? Name. Let's call it Open Mix Form Button. Sounds reasonable. Now let's give it an on-click event in code. And so what we want to do when we click the Open Mix Form button is obviously open the mix form. So what we'll do is we'll do a do command open form, like so. We want to open the mix form and we'll open it as AC normal. But we want to pass some arguments, so let's stick in a few commas until we get to the open arguments parameter. And what we want to do is we want to pass the recipe ID and whether we want it to be creating a new mix of that recipe ID or to view all of the existing mixes for that recipe. We don't have any of those, so for the moment we'll just deal with the fact that it's going to be always creating a new mix of the recipe. So anyway, we get the recipe ID from the recipe ID box on the form. Oops, like so. And that is taking it from this field here, which is already on the form. And then what we'll do is we'll add in our double star, our double asterisk, so that it knows that anything before that was a recipe ID value and everything after that is whether we want it to be a new mix. And as we always do currently want to make it a new mix, we'll just stick the 1 in there so we can test to see if that is 1, make a new mix. So that'll do for that. We'll close that and yes, we'll save it. We'll go back to our mix ingredient form design view. No, not that one. The mix form design view. Hello, yes, that's it. And if we sort of recap what the code in here was doing that we wrote a minute ago, so those arguments are going to be passed across and it's then going to split it on the double star, and as we saw that we're passing over the recipe ID before the star and we're passing over a 1 after the star. So what we can do is close that. If we run this, you'll see that actually we have just opened it to show all mixes because we didn't pass anything into it. We've got nothing in here. So let's close it and save it. Let's go to our control panel and let's select a recipe and let's take vanilla custard. Let's open the recipe. All this we had before, but we now have this make mix button. So if we click the make mix button, bear in mind the recipe ID we're looking at here is 2. Oh, we've got an error. We've got a type mismatch error. And why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Well, that should be an ampersand, not a star. So that's a little bit of a typo there. Close that. Let's close this. Yes, yes. And let's try that again. Vanilla custard, open recipe. check it's 2. Yes, it is 2. Make mix. And it hasn't worked. Oh dear, let me have an investigation. Well, yeah, pretty obvious why it doesn't work. We didn't put any code in to fill in that recipe ID requested little text box there. All we've done is got the data being passed across and assigned it to some variables. So what we should do probably is address that. And if we go onto the form again, what we'll do is we'll put this in the onload handler. The reason why is because in the onOpen, this is happening as the form opens. There's no data loaded yet. The structure isn't really there. So we want all of the data to be loaded before we start jigging about with it. So let's use the onload event, which will happen when all the data is loaded. And as you'll see down here, moving on to the load event now, so data is loaded before continuing. Yeah, I even put it in the comments. So what we want to do now that we've dealt with that is, if an ID has been passed, then we want to make, you know, that little text box there have that ID as its value. So what we'll do is we'll say, and we'll use the global variable for this. Why not? If the recipe ID is passed from here and blah, 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 ends up in the global variable called global RID is not blank, then stick it into that little text box. Now if we close this and close that and save it and go to the control panel and select a recipe, vanilla custard, and open recipe and click make mix, you'll see the recipe ID requested is 2, so that we have successfully passed across the recipe ID that we want to create a mix from. And that really will do for today. Watching paint dry would be more interesting.